Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Joining me now is Shaleen Title. She was the inaugural commissioner of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission for 2017 to 2020. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh, thank you so much for and being a supporter of the show, listening to the show. We talk a lot about justice in all categories. And I'm curious if you could describe what your work was as the inaugural commissioner, and then what your work will be now that you're no longer with them.
So the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission is the regulating agency that was put in charge of implementing legalization in Massachusetts. And it's now a 80-person agency, a budget of about $12 million. It has a very big job, but when we started, it was just 5 commissioners. And it's a very, it's an independent agency. And I think in some ways turned out to be a model of what governance by regular people can look like. But I'll tell you how I got there, because I get a lot of questions. Sometimes people see what I say and how I speak, and they're like, how did you become a commissioner? It was about a 20-year journey. So I started in college. When you are looking, people tend to look at different issues and, go through an awakening. And I was interested in the anti-war movement, universal health care, climate change, but there was something different about marijuana legalization, particularly the way that it was youth-led at the time. And we had a coalition that focused on being where the people are and not where politicians are, which is a very big divide, especially on marijuana legalization. And so after working on that, going through law school and being in the legalization movement full time, I got to work on the campaign in Colorado that legalized marijuana for the first time. So I came back here in Massachusetts, and I was working on trying to make legalization laws become more robust, because there are uniquely cruel ways that the war on drugs targets certain populations, like students taking away their financial aid, immigrants deporting people for minor drug violations, parents taking away children. And so I was focused on trying to go further with legalization. And at that time, now Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley was the city councilor in Boston. Yeah. And she was working on how to make Boston an equitable cannabis industry. And in particular, making sure that Black and Latino people who have been disproportionately harmed by the war on drugs were part of the now very profitable legal industry, economic justice. So, and by the way, if there's anybody who's watching who's thinking about being a public official, I'll tell you the 2 things that I learned from working with Congresswoman Pressley that were really important. One is, when she's working on an issue, she has her staff reach out and find the people who are experts rather than working with the lobbyists, that are coming to you. So that's how she found me. And then second, when I went in and talked to her, I will never forget the way that I felt so listened to. Like, I had never had someone take knowledge and lived experience so seriously before, someone in a position of power. And that's something I tried to do every day during my term, and that, I think not a lot of public officials focus on. So that's how I ended up becoming a commissioner.
And, there's so many routes and so many paths that you just spoke of. And there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I think we should dig into. One, speaking of the cruel ways that the war on drugs targeted Black and brown communities. In terms of the shift going forward, what specific things can be done to remedy the past ills of the war on drugs as we get ready to move into this era where marijuana is going to be eventually completely legalized and then capitalized on? Like, how are we bringing equity to Black people who have been imprisoned and lost their lives as a result of marijuana?
So we have some experience with that, not just in Massachusetts, but California and Illinois. So there is a beginning of a framework that I'll lay out. But I think it's extremely important that we understand that federal legalization is coming and somebody is going to benefit from this multi-billion-dollar industry. And even if soon to be President Biden is kind of stuck in the 80s in terms of drug policy, we have to make sure that we're pushing for an equity-centered federal legalization structure that learns from these different states.
Mm.
So what we learned, I would divide it into three things. The first is making sure that criminal justice going forward as it relates to marijuana is fair. And as I mentioned, that means parents aren't losing their kids, people aren't being immigrants aren't being deported. And we're making sure that people under 21 are being treated fairly and they're not being disproportionately targeted. And we also want to make sure that we're expunging records for people who are continuously being punished for past marijuana crimes, even once it's legal.
Mm. Mm.
The second piece of it is making sure that we are reinvesting tax revenue into those communities, whether they want to be in the business or not. Making sure that we spent so much of the government's money, targeting those communities. Now we want to make sure we're reinvesting. Mm. And then the final piece is the one that I spent most of my time working on, which is making sure that we have benefits for people from disproportionately harmed communities if they want to get into the industry. And what that looks like in Massachusetts is fee waivers, technical assistance programs, and for delivery businesses for 3 years, they will only be for businesses owned by people from those communities.
Fascinating. That's the type of solutions that, because to make it kind of practical, you said it. This is going to be billions upon billions of dollars in terms of industry. And as it stands right now, it looks like it's not going to go to the people who are the pioneers of this industry. And so some of the things I hear you saying are very specific as how we can turn those things. But let's talk about it on the other side. Like, honestly, I got to get you on the morning trap, the morning show, because Marcus, thank you. Marcus focuses on this a whole lot in his private businesses, because there also has to be a response from our side of the equation in terms of investments and getting into the industry and getting involved, making those actual investments. What would you say to people who are thinking about doing that, not only in terms of profit, right, but in terms of justice and bringing some equity to it? Because I feel like if we wait for the government to bring equity to it, Philip Morris and all the other tobacco companies would have already cornered the market.
Right. I think that what's holding that back from happening now is that we have this state by state patchwork where it's still federally illegal, and it is very difficult and challenging, and the risks are somewhat unknown if you're trying to invest in an industry that is federally illegal. So we have to work on both at the same time, making that investment structure that is led preferably by people of color and people with business experience, and focusing on federal legalization that's equitable as well, and learning from the lessons that we've seen in these other states. I can tell you what I want to avoid is that when I started my term, I was being approached by what I might describe as predatory or groups that just wanted these types of programs to be like kiddie programs on the side. Like, we'll have the retail store, but you can have like the little delivery service that like does the Uber Eats back and forth, and that's not good enough. It needs to be strong and robust and centered. And we've come too far to settle for something like that.
Yeah. What about yourself? Like, what are your moves, if you want to discuss them, in terms of next steps? Now that you're no longer part of the commission, are you looking at another way of making an impact in this industry?
Well, I know I don't want to turn right around and be a lobbyist. That's not the way I've conducted myself. I'm really interested in federal legalization and making sure that we're ready, because if we came this far, on the state level, and then we didn't, take those lessons federally, that would be a shame. So I'm focused there. And then I'm also just focused on dignity and respect for all people who use drugs. And that means focusing on prevention, education, treatment when it's needed, but especially for Black and Brown communities, that we are not punishing people just for using drugs or using drug laws as a way to hold down certain communities and not others. So I think there's a lot of incremental reform that's matching the way that society is starting to change the way it looks at drugs and drug users.
Amazing, amazing. Can you tell everyone how to get up with you and the best way to contact you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at Shaleen Title, and I am part of a group called the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition. If you're trying to do this kind of work in your state, you can get in touch with us and we'll help hook you up with best practices.
Awesome. Shaleen Title, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show and support The Benjamin Dixon Show. If you like this episode, be sure to share, like, and subscribe.